And to prove that we did go live, there is the cake. I really should have got someone to stand next to it for scale because it was a very large cake. But there it is. So we had Alma and Primo via Alma available for testing at lunchtime on Thursday the 4th of April. I should have said that while we were configuring and setting up Alma, Ex Libris and some Swinburne people were also involved in building a parallel Primo to our production Primo. So our production Primo was pointing to Aleph, and they built a parallel Primo that was pointing to Alma. And then when we were ready, they just had to flick the switch and the users wouldn't really notice anything, but suddenly Primo would be interacting with Alma instead of Aleph. So they came up for testing at lunchtime on Thursday the 4th of April. We went live with Alma at 9 a.m. on Friday the 5th of April. We were planning to go live with Primo the following Monday, but because everything was looking pretty good, we flicked the switch to Primo via Alma, I think around lunchtime on Friday the 5th, so that actually came up ahead of schedule. Because we were the first Alma implementation in this region, our Ex Libris project manager, Melanie, was on site for 2 days to follow up on problems and help us through some of the tasks. And that was incredibly valuable because, as you probably know, if you've gone through a library system implementation, it doesn't matter how much testing you do, you won't find out about some of the problems until after you go live because your patrons will do things you would never have thought of. Some things, at least at the time we migrated, did not migrate from Aleph to Alma, and so we had to plan on whether we would live without those or migrate them manually in the live system after we came up. So examples of those were unfilled holds did not migrate, processing for missing and lost items did not migrate, instructors for course reserves, and the interested user, which is essentially the requester for an acquisitions order, did not migrate. We plan to manually replicate these in Alma after we went live, and some of these were less work and some of these were a huge amount of work, and some of these went very well and a couple of these went incredibly wrong. Actually, I should talk a bit more about that, shouldn't I? Adding instructors for course reserves and adding the interested user for acquisition orders was really just a question of getting reports from Ex Libris and sitting people down and typing the data in, and that was quite simple. Entering the unfilled hold requests was much more problematic. And here's a tip, because we got this a bit wrong, and Ex Libris really didn't advise us, and maybe they weren't aware of how this would go wrong. Swinburne uses title level holds, and so after the migration we got a spreadsheet of all our unfilled hold requests so that we could type them into Alma. And essentially what we got was a list of barcodes. So we would type in the patron barcode, and then we would type in the barcode for the hold the person wanted, and then Alma would place the hold. We didn't realise at the time that because we were searching for the item by barcode, because that was what was on our spreadsheet, Alma was helpfully assuming we wanted an item level hold rather than a title level hold, and so we entered thousands of item level holds by mistake. And we didn't realise this until we tried to fill those holds as the items came back from loan, and they weren't trapping the holds, and we didn't understand why. And that's when we realised, in fact, what we had done was create an item level hold on a particular item rather than on a title. We struck another problem then when we went to produce the hold pick lists from the shelf to try and then trap the holds with the actual item the person had placed the hold on, because the hold pick list, although we had placed the hold using the item barcode is not listed on the hold pick list, so we had no way to actually match the item with the hold, and this caused huge problems in circulation and a lot of frustration for our lending staff. Similarly, there were problems with the migration or the non-migration of the missing and lost items. In Aleph, a lost or missing item is a process status, and in Alma, a lost or missing item is part of a workflow. So rather than being able to just migrate something from one process status to another, we had to manually try and put items into the correct stage of a workflow. But because of the way the migration happened, we had a lot of problems doing this. And I believe we still have some problems, I think, with cleaning up some of these, but they have been fixed in some of the fixes we've received since going live. So I'd just like to flag that those are things you'll need to pay careful attention to if you are planning to do those after migration. So we did build an Alma version of Primo in parallel with our Aleph Primo, which went live on the 5th of April. But here's a tip for other people. Because we were concentrating so much on Alma, we possibly didn't pay enough attention to Primo, and we allowed our Primo updates to fall behind. We reported problems with Primo. It often turned out that the problem was caused by the fact that we hadn't kept our updates up to date. Often the Primo updates, rather than delivering new features, were actually delivering configuration changes that allowed Primo to work better with Alma. And because we hadn't installed the updates, things were going wrong in Primo via Alma. And once we caught up with those, most of those problems did go away. The early version of the ANZREG journals list in Primo Alma was definitely a backward step from Primo via Aleph, but that has largely caught up since Primo 4.4. Something we never really understood and are still grappling with now is the Alma U-Resolver, which is essentially Alma's version of the SFX menu. So if you want to do things like provide links to interlibrary loan services or additional services for people who are doing searching, you'll need to do this in the Alma U-Resolver. Also, we were given some incorrect advice here in that this actually also needs to be set up as part of Primo. So we are still several months after going live working through some of these issues. And also, finally, just a tip for people who are coming from sites that are still using the Aleph OPAC or the Voyager OPAC, Alma has no OPAC, so you will need to plan for that. Luckily for Swinburne, when we moved from Dynex to Aleph and Primo in January 2010, we decided that we would use Primo right from the start as our OPAC, and we never used the Aleph OPAC, so it wasn't an issue for us, but it might be an issue if you are currently using the Aleph OPAC or the Voyager OPAC. So Primo will be your OPAC. Certification. Exlibris will offer training for you in configuration, and only people who have been certified have access to configuration menus in Alma. We fed back to Exlibris, and we are not the only site, and they appear to have taken this on board, that because you have no access to configuration until you've been trained, and you won't be trained until a month or 6 weeks after you go live, a lot of the system is kind of a bit like a black box to you, and you can't really see what's going on. We understand that Exlibris are planning so that you will get a view-only view of configuration before you have been certified, and then get full access to configuration once you have been certified, and that will give you a much better picture of how your setup of Alma has been done and what might be causing some of your issues. It was only after certification training where we could see our configuration that we could recognise what was causing some of our problems. And once we had been trained, some of those problems could be resolved quite quickly, but it had to wait a few weeks for us to be trained and get access to the configuration menus. Just some about change management at Swinburne. Our library director, Tula Morgan, came up with the phrase of bumping up against Alma, and our approach has been to try and see if we can try and work in the way Alma wants to work. Alma is designed around workflows, and life will be easier if we try to work with Alma rather than against Alma. So when we bump up against Alma, our first question now is, can we work in the way Alma wants to work rather than in the old ways we used to do things? So can we change our practices? Can we simplify? Does it matter if we stop doing things? There's a lot of cultural changes you might have to go to in your institution, so that things people have been used to doing in certain ways, you might have to look at that and say, well, we can't do that anymore, or we just can't worry about certain things anymore. Also, things we wish we had simplified way before migrating were our loan conditions and our acquisition funds. We have, in actuality, had a very simple budget structure, but we migrated a very complicated, no longer really used budget structure from Dynex into Aleph, and we migrated that from Aleph into Alma, and we are now planning to try and simplify that before our fiscal rollover at the end of this year. It really would have been good if we could have simplified that before we started with Alma. So there are a couple of areas I'd suggest that you pay attention to. There is very rapid development in Alma, so that when you report a problem as a support incident, the response will typically be that's going to be fixed in the October release, that's going to be fixed in the November release, that's going to be fixed in the December release. In Jira, you can assign a task as well as an issue, and you can set a date. So what we would do when we got an answer from Ex Libris that was something like, it will be fixed in the next release, is that we would close the issue but create a testing task so that we could test that the problem was in fact fixed. And if it was, we'd then close the issue. If it wasn't fixed, we could then re-raise the issue and progress that further with Ex Libris. Typically, the new releases of Alma happen on the third Sunday of the month, and the release notes come out the Thursday before. You don't get any choice, it just happens. It's just a date you plan for. So you plan to come in on the Monday after a new release, check, see if any of the planned improvements have maybe fixed some of your problems or allow you to now do things you've been waiting to do that you couldn't do before. But you might also need to keep an eye on the system, because things can go wrong after the monthly updates, and that's when you might need to do some additional testing and make sure other things haven't broken in the process. This process, Managing for Success, actually has recently closed at Swinburne, but we were appointed a Customer Success Manager, Yisrael Kuchar, who is based in Israel. And this is following the closure of the formal project when we were handed to support with Ex Libris. And Yisrael visited Swinburne for 2 days in June and sat with us and worked with people in the different functional areas to see what we were doing and how our system had been set up and what we were using the system for. He could see some things we had got wrong, so he could tell us better ways of doing things. He could also see that perhaps some configuration settings were not ideal and get those settings changed. But also he could see some Alma shortcomings and take these back to Israel and feed those back into the development process. A thing that became very clear to us from Yisrael's visit and our work after that through the success management process was that we had never really understood e-resource management, and Yisrael has been working with us, and to some extent still is, even though the formal process has finished, with working through some of those workflow processes. So I think that the way e-resources are managed in Alma and the Alma U-Resolver were the two areas that we really got a bit wrong, and we are still working through at the moment. So that's something we would encourage sites planning to go to Alma to pay particular attention to, and maybe put a bit more work into earlier than we did. When we were working with Israel, we had a thing called the Top 5, where we would have a fortnightly phone call with Israel, and in between we'd have a fortnightly meeting of the Alma project group, and we would prioritise our top 5 problems. Israel would go off and talk to the developers, come back with a progress report, which typically was, that will be fixed in the May release, that will be fixed in the June release. We'd then close those problems, set testing tasks for those, re-meet with the project team, raise the next lot of top 5 problems, and then work through those. We really did go through a lot of our more serious problems through the top 5 process as part of the success management program, and so it was a really valuable way to finish up our implementation. And finally, just a tip that you probably know this, but when you are involved in a big project like this, you tend to focus on the go-live date. But of course, going live is not the end of the project, and our busiest time for dealing with problems was probably in the month following go-live. we didn't find out about some problems until we were live. The other thing is that as you start to sort out some of those major problems, you'll become aware of smaller problems that perhaps you hadn't noticed, or indeed just features that you had completely forgotten about. So, for example, I think it was about a month after go live that we realised we had completely forgotten to activate our BX recommender service in Alma. So we did that, but in fact we were so busy sorting out our problems we hadn't even noticed it up until then. And there are certainly some things we now want to look at now that we're getting a bit more time, and one of those is the e-resource statistics use stats that is provided as part of Alma. And that's the end of my presentation. I think I've gone a little bit over time, but I hope that has been helpful for any of you who are planning to go live with Alma, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Right, thanks, Tony. I can see some applause going on there. Thank you very much. Now, if anyone's got and some more applause, that's great. If anyone's got any questions, please click on the little. Lots of applause. Click on the little hand.
I have to show. Yeah. It was a very strange experience sitting here on my own. I have to say, it was much nicer in a room on the Alma Roadshow, but seeing the applause is quite nice. Thank you.
Yeah, there you go. If anyone's got any questions, please put your hand up, literally by clicking the little hand icon, and I'll enable your mic for you. Here we go. There's one. I'll just enable your microphone, Vicky. There we go. It's just your microphone's just lit up. Yeah, I can hear you now, Vicky.
Okay, thanks. Sorry about that. Tony, I've never really got a clear answer from Ex-Libris. Why do they do the certification training so long after you go live date? Did they tell you?
No, but it might have been a bit late for Swinburne, but it might have been a bit early for RMIT because we shared our certification training with them. For Swinburne, the certification training was about 6 weeks after go live. For RMIT, it was the week they went live, which I think most people would realise that was far too early for them. So they were still in shell shock when the poor people from RMIT turned up. I think the plan is that you should go live, have a little bit of time to use the system in real life, and then once you've sorted out the main problems, then you probably are in the right mental space to be attending a training session. It's pretty heavy going. It's 2 pretty full-on days. And there is an exam which you have to pass in order to be certified. And I think that's okay. Our feedback to Ex-Libris, which they have told us they have heard from other sites and they have taken on board and are working to fix, is that you don't want people actually going in and making configuration changes until they know what they're doing, but you do want people to be able to see the configuration settings beforehand, so while you are implementing and before you've been trained. And so they are working on a view-only mode of configuration so that you would at least be able to see what the settings are. Because we had reported some problems and these problems were not resolved by Ex-Libris support, but after we had been certified and we looked at our configuration, we could instantly see, oh, you're not getting any claims notices because they're not turned on, that sort of thing.
Great, thanks, Tony. Okay, I've got another question here from Skulk, so I'm just going to switch your microphone off, Vicky. Now, it doesn't look like I can enable your microphone, Skulk, so I see that you've written a question up on the text interface, so I might just come to that. And the question you've got for Tony is, what metadata cleanup was done before migration?
Oh, gosh. We didn't really do much in the way of metadata cleanup itself. It was mostly about setting the rules for migration. And if this doesn't answer your question, you might like to email and I can ask our cataloging librarian if you need more details. A lot of it was about mapping data from fields in Aleph either to fields in Alma, or that it would cause certain things to happen in the migration. So, for example, we had to create a rule that would identify records in Aleph that would become what is called electronic inventory in Alma. and it's one of the rules we got spectacularly wrong in the first migration. All our ebooks came into Alma in the first migration as electronic inventory, but also with a physical location, which of course was a mistake. And that couldn't get fixed until the final migration just before go live. And you don't get a practice run. So you get your test migration and then you get your final migration, and there's nothing in between. So we obviously didn't pay enough attention to getting some of those migration rules correct. I don't think we did much data cleanup. We had possibly done a bit of tidying up in our Dynex to Aleph migration, but most of what we did was mapping things between Aleph and Alma rather than actually cleaning stuff up. It was mostly in mapping and configuration and rules about especially identifying records in Aleph that would come into Alma as physical items and records in Aleph that would come into Alma as electronic inventory.
Great, thanks, Tony. I've got another question here from Anna Wheeler, which is, if you were to employ a project manager, how long should you budget for them and how early should they start?
I noticed Fiona Burton is in the audience, and I noticed an advertisement from Macquarie for a full-time project manager and a full-time assistant for 12 months, and that sounds about right. You definitely wouldn't do what Swinburne did, which was a 0.6 person who basically started at kick-off. Let's see, we started our project board meeting in June. We started kick-off on the 1st of November. We went live in April and we closed the project at the end of June. So you can probably work it out from those dates. We should have had a full-time project manager on board from June, which was July, August, September, October, November, 4 to 5 months before our kick-off meeting. So they could have done a lot of the planning for the migration, a lot of the asking questions of Ex Libris, so that we had a much better understanding before we filled in our initial configuration and migration spreadsheet. They would have worked at simplifying some of our setup, some of our business rules, some of our, perhaps cleaning up some of our data. They would have assisted with getting our staff trained and focusing on what we needed to focus on, because of course Alma took up a huge part of job of lots of people who also had to do their job in the meantime. So having a project manager who can actually, drag people away from their real job to focus on Alma when you need to focus on Alma would have been really important. So I would say start a good few months before the kickoff meeting and continue for a couple of months after your go live date, which is probably about the time you would wrap up the project. I think the word from Ex Libris is that they would normally have intended to wrap up a project formally a month after go live, but for us it was actually 6 or 7 weeks after go live. But we were the first implementation in Asia Pacific, and we were the first implementation for the Ex Libris Australian office, so it probably did take longer than they would be planning for implementations going live now.
Great, thanks, Tony. We're just going to move over to Steve Lacey now. So, Steve, I'm just going to enable your microphone for you. You should be able to click on the lock button now.
I was just asking Tony whether he had the opportunity to have a test system to work some of these issues out. Was that option provided to you?
Okay. Now, when you go live with Alma, you will get what they call the vanilla sandbox or the generic sandbox, which we believe would be completely useless because it doesn't have any of your configuration settings, it doesn't have any of your data in it. It's basically a generic Ex Libris test system. There is an option to pay for a premium sandbox, which is basically an image of your live system refreshed 4 times a year with all your configuration settings and all your data. Swinburne did not choose to go with the premium sandbox during the project, but we have now just made a decision to purchase the premium sandbox, and we're in the process of buying it now. So we're hopeful of having the premium sandbox available within the next month. I'm not actually sure if it would have helped because the premium sandbox is a replica of the actual system. So it's just like having two systems. One's in production and one you can try other things out on. And really, when we were before go live, essentially we had the premium Sandbox. And then at go live, what they did was that just became our system. Having the premium Sandbox, what that would give you is that at go live, you would then have your production system, but you'd still have a system you could go and muck around on. Obviously, having now made the decision that we need to get the premium Sandbox, our advice would be to put that in your budget and plan for that right from the start. But I'm not sure how helpful it would have been leading up to go live, but it's certainly something we see a need for after go live, and it's something we would recommend to other sites.
Okay, thanks, Tony, for that.
Okay.
Thanks, Tony. And Vicky, just re-enabled your microphone for you.
Thank you.
Yep, I can hear you.
Tony, have you had much opportunity to play with the analytics?
Personally, no, because Monica, our project manager, when the project was wrapped up, she stayed on for about 3 or 4 weeks working with IT, and one of the tasks we asked Monica to do was to run some training sessions for library staff in analytics and also skill up the library system support people who are part of IT in being able to produce analytics reports. I attended the first day of Monica's training, and I have to confess it all went over my head, and I decided my brain wasn't big enough at that stage to learn Alma analytics, and I still could not create a report to save my life. But Alma is delivered with some out-of-the-box analytic reports, and our library system support staff have been trained to produce those reports, and they are producing those reports. So, for example, I asked for a report a couple of weeks ago of one of our systems guys, and by the next day he had created the report and put it on my analytic dashboard, and it's just sitting there and I can run that report whenever I need to. There are some issues with analytics at the moment. Xlibris always planned for the analytics data to be refreshed daily, and until now it is only being refreshed weekly, but I believe the November release will allow them to go to the nightly updates of the analytic data. And just also another tip, when they do that, and when you are running analytic reports, you just have to realise that you're running the reports on the data as at yesterday. It will always be 1 day behind. So if you're running reports in analytics, it's always at least 1 day behind. But you can run reports in Alma itself. So sometimes we have gone to analytics to try and produce reports, and then we've realised that actually it's easier and better if we just work on the set management in Alma itself to produce a report. With one proviso, that there is a bug currently in Alma in that you can make a report, but when you try to export it to Excel, it doesn't work. So that we've reported that bug since virtually day one. At one stage, it did export part of the set, but not the complete set. Xlibris did some work, and I don't know if it's an improvement, but then it stopped working entirely, and you can't produce an Excel spreadsheet at all. It is still with development. We don't have a fixed date for that one yet, but it's something we are urgently waiting on, because sometimes reports are better written in Alma itself. And an example of that is where you are working with very large numbers in your set. An example is we need to produce a report of all our ebooks from providers except for EBL, so that we could send that to EBL for deduplication of our patron-driven collection. And we haven't been able to produce that report since we moved to Alma. Theoretically, you could run that report in analytics, but the size limit in analytics is something like 2,500 lines, and we would have about 350,000 lines in the report. So until they fix that in Alma and we can export that as a spreadsheet, we can't do anything about it.
Great, thanks, Tony. Well, I think we've probably got time for 2 more questions, and I see a couple that are already up on the text interface. One of them is saying, have you had many changes with the way that you update Patron records?
Oh, now I'm not the person to ask about this, because I do work in tech services. And partly we've had a lot of problems some of those problems may be due to Swinburne's old student system, which we're currently running. We did have an awful lot of problems trying to do Patron loads in the first month after go live. For a long time, we could not update our Patron records. I have to tell you that we can't get a Delta report out of our student system, so we do a complete Patron load every night, which is a massive file, and we had problems with it falling over, finding a problem record and just stopping, all sorts of things, and those problems eventually did get resolved. So we are now doing a nightly update of all our patrons, a complete load, using the file we extract from our student system and from our staff system. That might not answer your specific question, but if you did have a specific question, you might want to email me and I can pass that on probably to our library systems librarian who worked on the Patron loading issues we had, and she could get back to you.
Great, thanks, Tony. And just one more I've spotted here says, was there any SFX functionality that didn't migrate that you wish did?
Yes, almost all of it. What happened was that when we migrated SFX to Alma, full text targets that were activated in the SFX knowledge base were activated as records in the Alma community zone, which means that we had access, link resolver access to our full text content. What we lost were basically all the other services we used to provide on our SFX menu. So we currently do not have any links to interlibrary loan. We used to have a link from our SFX menu to our Relay interlibrary loan service, and we don't have that currently. We used to provide links to export to EndNote. We used to provide links to look up stuff in Web of Science. We'd let you search for something in Google Scholar, and we lost everything. And it's something we need to still work out how to do. The documentation on this is pretty thin. The Alma U-Resolver, which we didn't actually even understand what that was, is a one-line item on the project, and we didn't notice it until very close to go live when the question to Exlibris was, what's the U-Resolver? And it's something, here we are several months after go live, and we still haven't really done it all. So our advice would be to pay attention to that way earlier than we did, and put some effort into doing that. We have sent messages to the Alma list, and I'm not sure that many Alma libraries have really come to grips with the U-Resolver, and I'm not sure there are many Alma libraries that have implemented the interlibrary loan links as we have had in our old SFX menu. So, yeah, something to pay close attention to.
Great, thanks, Tony. Well, I think that kind of wraps us up for today. I just want to say a very big thank you for Tony, because I'm sure you've all found it extremely helpful and interesting. I'm going to click on the applaud button here so you can see some applause. So feel free to. There we go. And also thank you for your support too. Obviously, it's great to see the interest. This is the first of our presentations, if you like, and stay tuned because the ANZREG group will be sending out some more correspondence soon for presentation number 2. So thanks everyone, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you.